Northern California, June 25, 1846. In the burgeoning heat of the summer morning, the small village of Sonoma stirs with children at play, animals stirring, and citizens conducting business and carrying out chores. For weeks now, the small hamlet situated just north of San Francisco has been caught up in a groundswell of political upheaval that has been fostering amongst the American immigrants to this territory still owned by Mexico. Roughly 2 weeks earlier, 2 Americans named Fowler and Cowie had ventured to Bodega Bay from Sonoma in hopes of procuring arms and ammunition. They had been caught en route by Mexican guerrilla forces and, after being tied to a pair of oak trees and tortured, had been hanged. On June 14, 1846, the town had been taken over by men claiming it in the name of the Bear Flag Republic. Roughly 30 men, under the leadership of 40-year-old former mountain man Ezekiel Stuttering Zeke Merritt, had taken over Sonoma to essentially no resistance. The founder and mayor of the town, General Mariano Vallejo, is placed under arrest, and a white flag with a makeshift bear on it is raised over the town. The news of this action reaches California Governor Pio Pico, who orders Captain Joaquin de la Torre to take a contingent of soldiers under his command and quash this troublesome rebellion. But, much to his dismay, de la Torre has been repeatedly repulsed by the Americans, who are now calling themselves osos, or bears. The news of this action also soon reaches the ears of one Captain John C. Fremont. Though ostensibly on an exploratory mission at the behest of the United States government, Fremont has long fostered hopes that the Americans living in Mexico's Alta California would rebel against their overseers and annex California in the name of the United States. Now, the ambitious army officer who has advanced to the odd but prestigious position of military officer in charge of a scientific expedition is heartened to hear that his hopes have become a reality. Fremont and his party have spent the previous few years carrying out a variety of exploratory missions that have seen them cover vast expanses of the American West, and California in particular. They have survived all manner of privation, hardship, and travail. Just weeks prior, 3 members of their party had been killed by native warriors, believed to be Modocs, on the shores of what is today Oregon's Klamath Lake. Though many in the band are experienced mountain men and soldiers, they all readily acquiesce to the fact that they owe their survival, in large part, to the efforts of their legendary guide, Christopher Houston Carson, otherwise known as Kit Carson. Though only 36 years old, Kit Carson is already a legendary figure on the American frontier. Tales of his daring exploits in fighting native warriors, trapping little-known areas, and surviving all manner of wilderness hardships are well known by many on the eastern seaboard due to the popularity of the dime novels bearing his name. Though many are largely, or entirely, fictionalized, and Carson himself often bristles at any mention of his own celebrity, he is a celebrity nonetheless. However, despite his notoriety, Carson is a steadfastly dutiful and loyal man, whose already fastidious obedience to Fremont's authority has been even further solidified since the officer saved his life after riding his imposing war horse, a large gray steed named Sacramento, over a native warrior who had drawn an arrow on Carson in the woods of southern Oregon. The fact that this had likely saved his life is not lost on the legendary mountain man, and when Fremont suddenly gives the order that the party will make their way to Sonoma to reinforce and oversee the rebel forces, Carson obeys without question. Now, as the party makes its way into the small town during this sweltering morning on June 25th, the townsfolk are brought to a momentary pause. The men, who have for the most part made their homes in the wilderness for the preceding several months, cause quite a stir with the spectacle they present amidst the comparatively genteel townsfolk. In their trek southward to Sonoma, they have taken on several volunteers, and now present a buckskin-clad, ill-kempt, and unshaven multinational spectacle to the observing Sonomans. One among them commented that Fremont's group was composed of Americans, French, English, Swiss, Poles, Russians, Chileans, Germans, Greeks, Austrians, and Pawnees, and if De La Torre could beat them, he could beat the whole world. Within a matter of days, Fremont has taken over the town and taken over leadership of the rebellion. As the ranking military officer for hundreds of miles, Fremont exercises his martial authority over the rebels and promises them protection for their obedience. The settlers of Sonoma agree. even acquiescing to Fremont's request to formally move the recognized start date of the rebellion to coincide with his arrival, to defer all military and civil command to him, and to refer to him as Oso I. He begins signing all letters and dispatches Captain John C. Fremont, Commander-in-Chief of Military Forces in California, and orders the Osos under his command to iron and confine any person who shall disobey your commands, and to shoot any person who shall endanger the safety of the town. Among the Americans now caught in the fray of revolutionary politics and policing is Johann Sutter, a German-born, Swiss-descended immigrant who, in but a few years' time, will change California history forever with the discovery of gold at his lumber mill on the American River. However, now, in 1846, he is simply a prominent local who is beginning to find Fremont's methods distasteful, if not outright untenable. But when Sutter opposes the extremity of Fremont's orders to the ever more haughty officer's face, Fremont scornfully responds that if Sutter has any problems with his leadership, he can simply join up with the Mexican army. Such dismissiveness and self-importance begins to become more and more the order of the day for those dealing with Fremont. He expects those under his command to exhibit only loyalty, obedience, and discipline. One among his party who he can always count on to embody these traits is Kit Carson. Despite his advantage in both experience and ability, Carson time and again plays the part of dutiful sideman, seeing fit only to follow and enforce, but never to lead. However, Carson's reticence to command suits Fremont perfectly, and, of course, when Fremont decides within a few days of arriving in Sonoma that he must take the offensive and pursue Captain de la Torre, he chooses Kit Carson to accompany himself and a small contingent as they set out to engage the Mexican commander on his own ground. The party makes its way southwest from Sonoma to San Rafael, situated just north of San Francisco Bay. On their march, they intercept a Mexican army courier carrying dispatches from Captain de la Torre himself. Following the intelligence gleaned from the intercepted dispatches, Fremont leads the party straight to the northern shores of San Francisco Bay, near present-day San Quentin. However, the courier he has intercepted, as well as the information that the man carries, are all part of a carefully planned ruse being carried out by Captain de la Torre. When the Fremont party arrives on the shores of San Francisco Bay on Sunday, June 28, 1846, they are greeted by a confusingly empty expanse of coastline where they had expected to meet lines of Mexican soldiers ready to meet them in battle. Fremont is both embarrassed and incensed. His hopes of a swift and glorious victory have not only been dashed, but he has been made a fool of by the Mexican officer's clever deception. How, Fremont wonders, can he possibly conduct a successful war against an enemy who refuses to fight and who he cannot find? As the party of men lingers on the shores of the shallow bay, Fremont ponders his next move. He intends to take California by sweeping southward, from San Francisco to Santa Barbara, then on to Los Angeles and San Diego. But now, instead of a decisive victory, he has let his enemy slip away. Then, Fremont spots a small rowboat crossing the bay, headed for shore near he and his party's location. The small vessel makes its way through the brackish, chilly waters to the shoreline, where 3 men disembark and come ashore. They are 20-year-old Ramon de Haro and his twin brother, Francisco de Haro. They are sons of Don Francisco de Haro, former alcalde of San Francisco during the years of 1834, as well as 1838 through 1839. They are accompanied by their uncle, José de los Reyes Berriesa. Though the 3 are clearly civilians and not party to the actions of the Mexican military, Fremont orders Carson to detain them and search them for documents. Carson barks at the confused and increasingly fearful men to hand over any correspondence that they have on their person. All 3 insist that they have none, and are simply on a personal errand to meet friends and family in Sonoma. Carson, still unsure whether the men are telling the truth, calls out to Fremont, who is impatiently seated on his horse roughly 50 yards away. "Should I take these men prisoners?" he asks Fremont. "I have no use for prisoners," responds Fremont. Carson momentarily confers with other members of the party. What had Fremont meant, they wonder. Again, Fremont barks at Carson. "Mr. Carson, your duty." This final admonishment hangs in the air for a pregnant moment as the gravity of Fremont's command settles on Carson and his cohorts. The matter, it seems, has already been decided. Without an instant more of hesitation, Carson whirls, pistol in hand, towards the three confused and frightened men. Suddenly, the cacophony of gunfire roars out along the narrow strip of coastline. At almost the same instant, 20-year-old Ramon de Haro falls to the ground, mortally wounded. Before he is able to fully comprehend what is happening, Francisco de Haro falls, mortally wounded, as a second shot rings out from Carson's pistol. Now, as his two nephews lie on the beach rapidly expiring, the elderly Berryessa cries out in confusion and grief. His bereaved cries pierce the air until he, too, is cut down by a final shot from Carson's pistol. Moments later, all three men, who had only minutes before been paddling across the waters of the bay, all lie still in death. Fremont is, for the time being, satisfied, and Carson, for his part, seems altogether unbothered by the gruesome event. The entire affair, however brief, presents a confounding picture to both contemporary observers and to those viewing the events through the lens of posterity. While it might seem clear to most that Fremont's vainglorious nature provided the catalyst for the murders of three innocent citizens, Carson's lack of hesitation or consternation has been a cause for much confusion. While many might attribute his actions to racial motives, Carson was himself married to a Mexican citizen named Josefa Jaramillo, whom he was fiercely devoted to, and had even converted to Catholicism in order to marry. The couple had several children who were not only of mixed blood, but mixed culture, being raised in the inexorable cultural milieu of Santa Fe, the couple's lifelong home. Carson also had been married previously to two different Native American women, one of whom had borne him children. Suffice to say, racial prejudices were likely not the driving force in Carson's cold-blooded executions of the de Haro twins and the elderly Berryessa. Nor was Carson party to the fits of jingoistic fervor that so often enraptured his cohorts and countrymen. Though certainly a proud American citizen and at least a tacit adherent to the doctrine of manifest destiny, Carson did not possess an overt passion for the expansion of his country at any and all costs. To Carson, the West was a real place, alive with cultures, conflicts, commodities, and compromise, not an abstract notion that could be conquered in the name of politicians and policymakers. However, with all that said, Carson was a man with an unwavering allegiance to authority. He was largely illiterate and had not been privy to the higher education and high society that many of his superiors had been. Carson, despite his record and reputation, felt a seemingly unshakable sense of inferiority when interacting with those imbued with governmental or societal authority. Such was the case concerning his relationship with John C. Fremont. Fremont's pedigree, connections, and title carried such significant weight. Montana, 1836. In the middle of the night, in the dead of winter, a young fur trapper named Isaac P. Rose shakes himself free from the warmth of the buffalo robe he has been sleeping in and rises to his feet. In a daze, the man wanders into the freezing, ominous darkness of the woods that surround his and his companion's small campsite. He trudges to a spot a few dozen yards away, feeling inextricably drawn to a small clearing just beyond the tree line. As he comes into view of the clearing, he is shocked to see the hulking figure of a lone grizzly bear. For the veteran mountain man, the sight of a grizzly bear here in the wilds near Clark's Fork on the Yellowstone River is not at all unusual. However, this grizzly is standing on his hind legs, nearly 8 feet tall, and staring intently at the bewildered man. Locking eyes with Rose, the bear walks up to the man, striding in an eerily human-like gait, and speaks. He tells Rose, in a deep, steady voice, to shake his hand. Rose, more confused than afraid, offers the hulking beast his left hand. The bear refuses to take it. Rose, sensing the animal's offense, hurriedly extends his right hand instead. At this, the bear silently and solemnly shakes the man's hand with both of his massive paws. Then, the bear suddenly disappears with a gust of icy wind. Just as suddenly, Rose finds himself awakened by the morning sun, still wrapped in the warm buffalo blanket. It had all, of course, been a dream. Rose and his fellow mountain men, a party composed of himself, as well as Joe Meek, Jack Larison, and Mark Heed, have departed from their main company to procure meat for their starving comrades. The main party, under the leadership of the legendary mountain man Jim Bridger, are camped 30 miles away. They are counting on Rose and their other comrades to ease the troublesome burden of surviving the harsh winter at hand. They have thus far been successful, as they have managed to kill so many buffalo that, after one day's hunt, 4 of the 8 horses that have been brought along to pack the meat now find themselves burdened by full loads. The snow is deep, and travel has been slow. With another long, cold day ahead of them, the 4 trappers begin to pack their things and make ready for travel. As they do this, Rose recounts his strange dream to his companions, partly for their amusement, and partly hoping one of them might proffer an explanation as to the meaning of it. He tells them how Caleb, the colloquial name amongst the mountain men for the grizzly bear, had come to him in a dream, that he had spoken and only shaken his right hand. Joe Meek, another veteran trapper, shakes his head and lowers his concerned eyes on Rose. "You better look out, Rose, or you'll shake hands with Beelzebub before night." While the grizzly bear certainly instills a healthy sense of respect and fear in any mountain man, what they fear most is coming into contact with Beelzebub. Though this name is used in the New Testament for the devil, that is not the image that comes to the typical trapper's mind when they hear the word. For these men, the most fearful entity that they might encounter here in the wilds, thousands of miles from their places of birth, is not the grizzly, nor is it the venomous snakes, nor buffalo stampedes, wolves, mountain lions, flash floods, avalanches, or wildfires. For the mountain men, their greatest fear is the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot, or Siksika, had originated in the northeast, near the area between modern-day Maine and Canada. They would eventually make their way to the Great Lakes region, and then, even further west, to the expanses of the plains of present-day Alberta, Canada, and the state of Montana. They had subsisted in these unforgiving environs for centuries as foot-bound hunters. Before the introduction of the horse into the Blackfoot culture in the 18th century, they had survived by chasing buffalo herds off of cliffs, gathering at the bottom to butcher the animals. Their cultural transformation to a horse-based people who hunted, conducted warfare, and traveled on horseback was delayed far longer than tribes further south. This was due more to geography than anything else, as the Blackfoot's northerly location placed them farther away from the large populations of horses found in Mexico and Texas. But, however forestalled their transformation might have been, it had also been incredibly rapid and incredibly consequential on the northern plains. The Blackfoot had quickly mastered hunting and fighting from atop charging mounts and had proven the most formidable power in the area for decades by the time Isaac Rose and his comrades ventured into their territory in the 1830s. During the winter months, which can often amount to more than half the year in these northernmost reaches of the Great Plains, the Blackfoot set up their villages in wooded river valleys. On the rare occasion that they venture out from these quarters, it is generally to partake in the same practice as Rose and his companions. They hunt the buffalo herds that hunker down in wooded areas and harvest as many as they can carry back in order to sustain their families and community until the long-awaited end of winter. For their part, the buffalo are more than simply a main food source of the Blackfoot. For the Blackfoot, nearly every tool and furnishing at their disposal comes, in some form or fashion, from the buffalo. Properly known as the American bison or plains bison, they are the largest animal on the North American continent. The largest males can weigh upwards of 2,000 pounds and be incredibly unpredictable. They roam virtually the entirety of the middle of the continent, from northern Canada to Mexico, in what is known as the Bison Belt. At their peak, most experts estimate their population to range from 30 to 50 million, with some estimates being as high as 75 million. Their thick hides provide the material with which the Blackfoot and other plains tribes construct their teepees. Their bones, hooves, and horns are used to construct tools and cooking utensils. Bison meat is, of course, the basis of the Blackfoot diet. Roasted, fried, boiled, dried, or raw, it can be prepared and consumed in a variety of manners. To the Blackfoot, the buffalo are a sacred gift from their creator, one meant to sustain their way of life and livelihood. As such, they see fit to protect their resources by any means necessary. Since the buffalo herds are such an important resource for the Blackfoot, any incursion into their territory, and especially any hunting of the buffalo on that territory, is seen as an offense punishable by death. Hugh Monroe, a Canadian fur trapper who was adopted into the Blackfoot, gives his account of how viciously the Blackfoot dealt with intruders, even of other native tribes. After finding a still smoldering campfire of a neighboring tribe referred to as the River People, the Blackfoot whom Monroe was living with became inconsolably irate and set on revenge. He asked one warrior, a man named Lone Walker, what had happened. Monroe's account is as follows. "The campers here were River People," said Lone Walker. "We have forbidden them to come over here to our plains, but they keep coming and stealing our buffaloes. We shall now make them cry." "You are going to fight them?" asked Monroe. "Yes," said Lone Walker. "I shivered," recalls Monroe. "In my mind's eye, I saw a great battle of arrows flying and guns booming, and men falling and crying out in their death and agony. And for what? Just a few buffalo that blackened the plains? Don't fight," pleaded Monroe. "There are plenty of buffaloes. Let the River People go in peace with what they have killed." "But," the Canadian recalled, "he gave me no answer other than a grim smile, and rode out to meet the head of the Blackfoot column. In the ensuing fight, the Blackfoot would kill 7 of the River People's warriors, as their women and children fled in a desperate panic. All 7 dead warriors would be scalped and otherwise mutilated, as equal parts punishment and warning. Afterwards, a great celebration was held. In their present circumstances, Rose and his fellow trappers are, of course, well aware of the danger their venture has placed them in. However, they are also aware that the buffalo meat they return to their company with could quite literally be the difference between a relatively comfortable winter and possibly starving to death in the middle of nowhere. And so now, for the time being, they are not dissuaded from their job at hand. The 4 men plan to continue on with their day, spending it much the same as they had the day before. Rose, the most reliable shot, would fall a buffalo, and then they would all set into quartering and packing the meat. However, after seeing several hundred of the animals, they have proven so unusually skittish that Rose cannot get close enough to get off a shot. This suspicious behavior spells only one sure thing, according to the veteran mountain man's instincts, that the Blackfoot are nearby. The trappers agree that their best course of action is to return to the camp with the buffalo meat they have been able to procure so far. They head southeast through rolling hills. As the men ride, conversation is kept to a minimum, and their eyes continually scan the landscape around them. They all know that being caught with a bounty of buffalo meat will likely spell a torturous end at the hands of the Blackfoot. This end could certainly come via a variety of tortures routinely employed by almost all Plains tribes. These included being staked out in the summer sun, burned under red-hot coals, or quite literally being carved to pieces as their torturers, along with the women and children of the tribe, laugh at and chide them. But a hard death could also, as Rose and company had found out only weeks earlier, be suffered even after escaping a Blackfoot attack. A Delaware tribesman named Manhead, who had been traveling with the fur company, had been out hunting with Rose when the pair were suddenly attacked by a small group of Blackfoot warriors. Rose and Manhead had managed to make it back to camp, with Manhead suffering only a flesh wound from a bullet in his calf. But as soon as they reached camp, Manhead informed Rose that he had been hit with a dreaded poison bullet, and his demise was all but certain. Over the succeeding hours, the unfortunate Delaware would suffer an agonizing death. In his biographical work on Isaac Rose titled 4 Years in the Rockies, author James B. Marsh addresses the reader directly in how these poison bullets were made. Perhaps our readers may not be fully aware of the method resorted to by the Indians to poison their bullets. It is done this way. A small piece of buffalo meat is placed on the end of a forked stick, and a rattlesnake is induced to strike it with his fangs. This poisoned meat is then dried, pounded into a powder, and placed in a small bag. When the Indian intends to use one of these poisoned bullets, he first puts it in his mouth and chews it for some time. Then dips it into the bag, and the slightest wound from one of these bullets can cause death. As the trappers try to push these fears from their mind and focus on the task at hand, they feel an inexorable tension as the undulating terrain provides ample cover for a Blackfoot ambush. All they can hope for now is to make it back to their company's main camp and the comparative safety in numbers it provides. But after a few long hours of riding, it appears to the trappers as though they might actually make it to their destination unscathed. Then, just as they are about to reach a small ravine, a party of 8 Blackfoot spring up, screaming their defiant, powerful war cries. The lead Blackfoot warrior is scarcely 10 feet from Rose when the attack begins. Rose, in the lead, wheels his horse and is now the closest target for the Blackfoot to attack. Almost as suddenly as he can turn his horse to flee, the air is filled with the roar of gunfire, and Blackfoot musket balls whiz all around him. One of the balls passes through his cap, while another rips across his chest, leaving a jagged but shallow cut across his skin and cutting the strings of his shot pouch, causing the critical piece of weaponry to fall to the ground. Another ball passes through the wrist of his buckskin glove, again miraculously only causing minor superficial damage to the wrist. Rose's most grievous wound comes when one of the lead balls smashes into his right elbow. The ball enters just above the joint and exits through the forearm, rendering the limb all but useless for the time being. The Blackfoot warrior nearest Rose, seeing he is now incapacitated, rides forward to finish the attack. The warrior attempts to grab Rose's horse by its bridle with one hand while attempting to shove Rose from the animal. Rose uses his severely injured right hand to hang on to the reins, while he repeatedly strikes the Blackfoot warrior in the face with his riding whip. As he does this, Rose's horse panics and lurches away from the Blackfoot, taking off in a dead run in the direction of the other trappers. This is a fortuitous break for the mountain man. However, as the horse wheels around to make their escape, Rose's rifle falls from his lap. He now realizes he is severely wounded and without any means of defense save for his hunting knife and tomahawk. His only remaining hope now is to hang on for dear life as his horse makes a mad dash away from the Blackfoot. Gritting his teeth, Rose urges the animal onward, doing all he can to hang on to the reins with his one working arm. Looking behind him, he sees the Blackfoot warrior closest in pursuit stop to pick up Rose's valuable rifle from the ground, fumbling with the rifle's leather scabbard. Rose again turns his gaze forward, hunkered down as low as possible next to his horse's neck. He then hears a sound he is well familiar with, the crack of his own rifle, followed by the sound of yet another musket ball whizzing by his head. Rose's charging steed manages to catch up to the party of 3 other trappers, whose retreat has been slowed by their heavily burdened pack animals. Seeing no better option, Jack Larison cuts the straps holding the loads to the animals, leaving hundreds of pounds of meat spilled upon the rolling prairie. Larison calls out to Rose, asking, "Are you killed, old boy?" "Not killed, but badly wounded," Rose replies. "Hurry forward, boys, and save yourselves if you can." Rose and his cohorts must now cover 30 miles of prairie in order to get back to the safety of their company. In a fortuitous break for the party, the Blackfoot have halted their pursuit in order to reclaim the buffalo meat that has been dropped by the trappers. Though they are now empty-handed, they are all alive. Rose, however, is beginning to rapidly decline over the course of the ride. His arm throbs in immense pain, and he is wrought with nausea and dizziness. For hours, he rides through icy winds and snow-covered grounds, his right arm dangling uselessly by his side. It is soon apparent that at least one of his wounds is the result of a poisoned bullet. As the trappers finally reach camp, it is readily apparent to all that Rose is on the verge of death. He is pulled off of his horse and carried into a tent where Jim Bridger and a Delaware medicine man examine him. Both concur that he is the victim of a poisoned bullet and that he has likely only survived this long due to the blood loss he has incurred during the ride. For the next few days, Rose lies in a tent battling for his life against the effects of the poison and blood loss. His arm swells to a nearly unrecognizable mass, causing fissures in the skin at the shoulder. His nervous system becomes, in his own later words, fearfully disorganized, and even the slightest noise, light, or motion causes him great distress. His fellow trappers do all within their power to care for him, though little can be done other than keeping the wound clean and letting the man sleep as best he can. Most of his friends fear, if not outright assume, that he will not survive long. However, after about a week, the wound begins to heal. Soon, Rose is able to eat and walk, and, within a matter of only a few weeks, he is back to work, hunting and trapping. However, Rose will scarcely have regained the ability to hold down food by the time an injured scout comes riding into camp, seemingly in a full panic. The scout, a Mexican man known as Masaeno, has been shot in the ankle, though thankfully not by a poisoned bullet, and has only escaped certain death at the hands of a roving Blackfoot band by hurling himself off of a steep cliff which they were not willing to follow him down. Masaeno reports that the Blackfoot are coalescing in a winter camp on the Yellowstone River 4 miles to the south of the trappers' current location. The village is nearly 1,000 lodges strong, he says, and when they discover the trappers' location, the trappers will surely be wiped out. And so, the fight for the frontier will continue. Bridger will order his men to construct a makeshift fort, and the men to hunker down for what will be one of the most brutal encounters between native tribes and mountain men in the history of the Old West. But the accounts of that battle, as well as the countless other tales of conflict and coexistence between tribespeople and trappers, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Eastern Idaho, 1832. As bullets whiz by them and the sounds of gunshots fill the air, a group of Blackfoot warriors urge their galloping horses towards a small lake ensconced in the mountainous terrain. Behind them, in hot pursuit, ride several American fur trappers, firing their single-shot rifles and pistols to the best of their abilities while riding atop their galloping mounts. With little option in the way of escape, the small group of Blackfoot warriors take to the frigid waters of the small lake. Here, with their horses in water up to their withers, the warriors now launch arrows towards their attackers. The fur trappers in hot pursuit are momentarily stalled, not wanting to risk bogging their horses down in the water by furthering their attack. They retreat to a position on the banks of the small body of water under cover of the area's abundant timber. From here, they trade shots with the waterlogged Blackfoot, assuming their quarry to be trapped and all but assuredly doomed. But this Blackfoot hunting party the trappers have happened upon are in fact only one small part of a larger band of Blackfoot camped only a few miles away. When one warrior on a particularly fleet pony makes his way back to their village, reinforcements are quickly gathered, and in mere minutes, a force of hundreds of Blackfoot warriors are mounted and charging out of the camp towards their brethren who are trapped in the waters of the lake. Soon, it is the American fur trappers who are on the defensive, as the newly arrived Blackfoot reinforcements pour over the hilltop behind them. At the head of the attack is a Blackfoot chief named Eagle Ribs. He is a member of the Buffalo Society and among the very few warriors allowed to wear the horns of the buffalo as a headdress. He rides in front of his warriors, all among them incensed at the trappers' attack. In the preceding few months, the Blackfoot had killed numerous fur trappers in the area, along the Yellowstone and Gallatin rivers. They are, without question, the most feared tribe among the trappers here on the northern plains. The Blackfoot are a powerful warrior tribe, the ruling power here on the northern plains, a title they have earned through years of ruthless expansion after the introduction of the horse to their people sometime in the 17th century led to a veritable explosion in capabilities in both hunting and raiding. Now, as they turn the tide of the trappers' attack, a shudder flows down the spines of the once bellicose mountain men, as all among them know that, while being killed by the Blackfoot will surely be a terrifying end, it will pale in comparison to the agonies that await them should they be taken alive. Now, under a hail of arrows and bullets, the trappers are forced to retreat from their position, abandoning their attack and riding back towards their own camp several miles away. Just minutes prior to their arrival, the camp had been a typical scene of activities, with men carrying out chores, repairing equipment, and checking their inventories. But as the first riders fleeing the Blackfoot race into camp, the routine of the morning is quickly broken, and it is readily apparent to the trappers that they will now have to take immediate action in a fight for their lives. Now, the men amongst the trappers' forces will soon face the full might of the Blackfoot's martial prowess brought to bear on them here in the middle of the wilds of the Idaho mountains. Among the trappers is 28-year-old Jim Bridger, one of the most experienced among them, and for all intents and purposes, their elected leader. Bridger has seen more of the American West than most living men. Born James Felix Bridger in Richmond, Virginia in 1804, Bridger had come west like so many countless other American young men in the early 19th century, in search of adventure and fortune. As a teenage neophyte to the frontier, on his first trapping expedition, Bridger had been part of the seminal Ashley's 100 fur trapping expedition that set out from St. Louis in 1823. While on this initial foray into the world of the mountain men, Bridger had been one of the 2 men charged with remaining with Hugh Glass after his now infamous misfortune of being severely mauled by a mother grizzly in present-day South Dakota. Glass, a legendary trapper in his own right, and already a noted veteran by the time Jim Bridger arrived on the frontier, had been so badly wounded that his comrades, unable and unwilling to linger in a dangerous hostile native territory for what they saw as an exercise in futility, had left Bridger and another trapper named John Fitzgerald to remain with Glass until he inevitably expired from his wounds. But as Bridger and Fitzgerald fretfully waited hour after hour in the frigid, dangerous territory for their comrade to finally succumb to his condition, he proved amazingly and frustratingly resilient. Though he appeared to continue to decline, Glass simply refused to die. After their nerves had been sufficiently rattled by the prospect of being captured alive by hostile natives, they had weighed their options and chose, regrettably, to leave Glass to his seemingly inevitable fate. They had eventually made their way back to civilization, where the young Bridger had joined up with another fur company, and Fitzgerald had gone on to join the army. But Hugh Glass did not die. Instead, in a feat that is now etched in the annals of frontier legend, he managed to survive and effectively drag himself hundreds of miles to the nearest fort, where his wounds were treated and his life miraculously saved. Once recovered, Glass had eventually sought revenge on Bridger and Fitzgerald, but found Fitzgerald now under the protection of the U.S. Army and Bridger to be just a teenage boy. He ultimately forgave the youngster and Fitzgerald out of the charity of his own heart. Despite this relatively inauspicious start, Bridger would remain undaunted in his pursuit of life as a mountain man. In the fall of 1824, he would become one of the first white men to explore the Yellowstone region of present-day northwestern Wyoming. Here, he was one of the first Americans to lay eyes on the parting of the waters at Yellowstone Lake. In 1830, he was part of a group that bought out the legendary Jedediah Smith's stake in what would come to be known as the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, a trapping outfit composed of several members of Ashley's 100 who sought to contest the powerful John Jacob Astor's monopolist American Fur Company. By 1834, however, with the decline of the beaver population and growing difficulty in turning a profit in the fur trade, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company was bought out by the American Fur Company and absorbed into Astor's corporate structure. In 1835, Bridger had married a woman named Emma from the Flathead tribe, a people who resided in the ranges of what is today western Montana and eastern Idaho. The couple would ultimately have 3 children together, necessitating, or perhaps excusing, Bridger's constant excursions with fur trapping companies into increasingly less profitable and increasingly dangerous territories. In this year of 1836, Bridger and his troop of fur trappers are on their way to the yearly rendezvous that will be held in present-day Idaho at a place called Pierre's Hole. The rendezvous is an annual tradition amongst the mountain men and local tribes, one that affords all a brief, fleeting respite from the drudgeries and dangers of life on the frontier. The furs and hides that had been so arduously gotten in the preceding year would be traded and sold. Goods and supplies would be bought and bartered for, and all could partake in the ample good food and drink. Songs, dances, gambling, gossip, as well as romantic liaisons between lonely mountain men and native women, all abounded. Though not the debauched and overtly drunken scene that is often portrayed, the yearly rendezvous was a lively and exciting affair. Bridger, as well as the rest of the mountain men in camp, had long looked forward to the affair, and now, with the rendezvous only days away, it had briefly seemed to all that they could almost taste the flowing hard cider and freshly baked breads. However, now, any thoughts of rest and recreation are quickly dashed as the influx of their comrades riding at full speed pours into the camp. The cry of "Blackfoot" quickly spreads throughout the camp, and now Jim Bridger and the rest of the trappers scramble to their single-shot rifles and make ready for the fight to come. The trappers take their positions in a loose battle line facing the direction of the approaching Blackfoot, and, for a few eerie moments, they can only hear the thundering hooves and war whoops of the warriors rapidly closing in to make their attack. Then, suddenly, the war party crests the top of the hill overlooking the campsite. Seeing the defensive line of mountain men protecting the camp, the Blackfoot pause atop the hill, just outside of rifle range. For a harrowing few minutes, a nervous tension permeates the air, as both parties warily appraise the size and strength of their opponent's forces. However, as the nervous trappers eye the sizable war party atop the hill in front of them, one amongst their party carefully and excitedly searches the lines of the mounted warriors, hoping to see a familiar face. She is the wife of one of the trappers, a Mexican man named Loretto, who had bartered for her freedom a number of years earlier after finding her as a prisoner of the Crow. She is, in fact, a member of the Blackfoot tribe. Though taken from her people as a young woman, she is intimately familiar with Blackfoot culture and customs, and, having not visited this territory for several years, might very possibly be a long-lost relative or friend to the attacking Blackfoot. While she finds no comfort in searching for a familiar face, what happens next brings a brief glimmer of hope to herself and all amongst the trappers. Calmly and coolly from atop the hill, Chief Eagle-Ribs now rides forward with a small group of warriors, bearing a pipe of peace and gesturing for the trappers to send a group of their own to discuss peace negotiations. Now, Jim Bridger enlists the help of the Blackfoot woman to act as an interpreter, and Bridger, the woman, and a small group of trappers now make their way towards the expanse between the two lines, all the while wary of a surprise attack from the Blackfoot. As an off-putting silence overtakes the battlefield, it seems to many present that all that can be heard is the plodding of the two parties' horses towards one another. As he rides in front of his group, Bridger begins to scan the line of Blackfoot warriors to the rear of Eagle-Ribs and his contingent, growing increasingly concerned as he nears the spot where the proposed negotiations are to take place. In only a precious few seconds, his suspicions overtake him, and as he, the other trappers, and the Blackfoot woman are mere yards away from Chief Eagle-Ribs and his men, with the chief now extending his hand in a gesture of peace, Bridger attempts to quietly pull back the hammer on his single-shot rifle. But in the tense silence that has befallen the would-be battlefield, the minute action resounds with a voluminous click, audible to all of those present, especially to Chief Eagle-Ribs. The Blackfoot chief instantly grabs the barrel of Bridger's rifle and thrusts it towards the ground. As he does so, Bridger attempts to pull the trigger and shoot the chief, but his bullet merely fires harmlessly into the dirt, Now, a violent struggle ensues between Bridger and Chief Eagle Ribs, and within moments, the entirety of both parties, with the exception of the Blackfoot woman, are in a full-pitched fight. As Bridger and the chief fight from atop their horses, another Blackfoot warrior sends an arrow whipping through the air and slamming into the small of Bridger's back. Moments later, a second arrow strikes just above the first, both projectiles embedding themselves deeply into the unfortunate man's torso. With Bridger now reeling in pain, Eagle Ribs now seizes the rifle from his hands and strikes Bridger from his horse with a powerful blow that Bridger at first assumes to have broken his neck. For her part, the Blackfoot woman takes this opportunity to flee back to the lines of the trappers and her husband and infant child. The Blackfoot warriors, however, quickly thwart her escape, cutting off her path and driving her back towards the Blackfoot. The distressed young mother now becomes irate, screaming inconsolably to be allowed to return to her child. The Blackfoot at first appear unmoved, but after recognizing her as a member of their own people, Chief Eagle Ribs instructs the young woman to call out to her husband and ask him to bring the child to her. He assures her that her husband and child will not be harmed. Minutes later, the nervous young father plods cautiously across the veritable no-man's land that lies between the trappers' lines and the Blackfoot. He assumes that he will likely be killed as soon as he reaches the Blackfoot, but drives himself on in hopes of at least delivering the child to her mother. To his surprise, he arrives at the Blackfoot lines unharmed and is allowed to hand the child over to his wife. However, this is where the charity of Eagle Ribs and his warriors has been exhausted. The man is instructed to now leave his wife and child and return to the trappers. He is promised that he will be left unharmed as he crosses and that his wife and child will be cared for. The unnerved trapper now makes his way, again, across the expanse of mountainous prairie, feverishly wondering if he has seen his young family for the last time. For the time being, it appears that he has, as the Blackfoot now take their newly returned tribal sister and her child with them as they sink over the hills and into the wilderness. The befuddled, heartbroken young father can only watch on. Meanwhile, though the Blackfoot have now left the battlefield, Jim Bridger's troubles have only begun, as the 2 arrows lodged deeply in his lower back now cause him excruciating pain with even the slightest movement. As his blood-soaked shirt is cut away, it is apparent to his attending brethren that extracting the arrows will be a difficult, painful process. While one of the arrows is pried free with relative ease, the second remains lodged immovably. The arrows employed by this band of Blackfoot are steel-tipped, acquired from trade with the British. Unlike their stone predecessors, these tips do not break or shatter, but bend and hook upon impact, making the extraction of a warped arrowhead all but impossible. After several excruciating attempts, the decision is made that the arrowhead will have to be left. The mountain men present, acting as rudimentary though serviceable physicians considering the circumstances, agree that any further surgical incursion into the wound by their untrained hands will only cause more damage. And so, the bent steel arrowhead is left where it has struck, embedded in the soft tissue of Jim Bridger's lower back. In this pitiable condition, Bridger is now forced to endure the agonizing ride to the rendezvous. The long-awaited trip is all but spoiled for the young mountain man, as his pride is also significantly wounded, having suffered not only the arrow wounds, but the theft of his rifle by the Blackfoot chief Eagle Ribs. Though Bridger is able to turn a substantial profit for his year's worth of trapping, the limitations of his condition only serve to dampen his spirits. But this will not be the last time that the legendary Jim Bridger will meet with the feared and fearsome Blackfoot. Though he will carry the arrowhead in his back for the remainder of his life, Bridger will return to the frontier in only a matter of weeks, and over the course of the succeeding years, he and his trapper cohorts will meet the Blackfoot in countless brutal confrontations in the fight to control the northern plains. But the many stories of the fabled life of Jim Bridger, as well as the countless instances of heroism, ferocity, selflessness, and tragedy that will occur in the battles between the mountain men and the Blackfoot in the years to come, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Montana, autumn 1835. In the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, a small group of American mountain men are caught in a vicious firefight with a war party of roughly 150 Blackfoot warriors. The mountain men, at first caught in the open, have retreated to the edge of a gully and are now assembled in a loose firing line, taking cover amongst the tall pine trees. Among them is 20-year-old Isaac P. Rose, a young fur trapper from Pennsylvania. He has only seen the Blackfoot a handful of times in his burgeoning career, but never this many warriors. Now, as arrows throng into the tree trunk in front of him, he attempts to calm his nerves and reload his single-shot rifle. As he works, his hands shake, his nerves rattled by the incessant Blackfoot war whoops that fill the air. Only yards away, 3 of his comrades lie retching and screaming in pain, already victims to Blackfoot arrows and bullets. Not far from them lie a number of dead and dying horses, their death rattles and spasming adding to the already distressing scene. Finally, after what seems to Rose to be an eternity, he manages to complete the reloading of his weapon. He takes a deep breath and then peers out from behind his cover to ascertain his next Blackfoot target. What he sees floods him with a sudden feeling of relief, as the Blackfoot now seem to be retreating. The resplendent warriors, armed with bows, lances, and muskets, are now all making their way to the top of a nearby ridge, away from the mountain men's position. A wave of confusion and hopeful consolation now seems to overtake the entirety of the trappers' party. Then, suddenly, they see that the Blackfoot have set fire to the prairie that lies in front of the mountain men's position. Within minutes, the fire has spread to the timberline, and minutes later, many of the drier pine trees are alight in sickening towers of flame. The Blackfoot's intent is twofold. One, they hope to obscure the retreat of their village by filling the air with smoke. And 2, they intend to use the fire to drive their quarry from their hiding spot and out into the open. Smoke and flames now fill the air, and the oppressive heat and spectacle of the flames causes a sense of panic amongst the trappers and their horses alike. Rose, now clearly and presently in the midst of the most hair-raising ordeal of his young life, takes stock of the situation with equal parts horror and confusion, and, for at least a fleeting second, ponders how he and his comrades have come to be here, and whether or not he would have been better served simply staying on the family farm instead of seeking this life of, quote, adventure. Rose's tenure as a mountain man had begun only the year prior, in the burgeoning frontier city of St. Louis. Born to a Pennsylvania farming family in 1815, he had quickly grown tired of the limitations of seasonal farming life. Seeking his fortune, he had first moved to the city of Newcastle, some 40 miles northwest of Pittsburgh. Finding no worthwhile prospects here, he and a friend named Joe Lewis had made their way to Pittsburgh. Here, they ascertained work as deckhands on a steamboat bound for Cincinnati. The job had only steeled Rose's ambitions to find a more esteemed profession, as the entirety of the trip saw he and his companion awoken every few hours to load firewood onto the boat at each stop at ports along the river. Finally, after a short stay in Cincinnati, the pair had made their way to St. Louis. Here, they met several men involved in the fur trade, known colloquially as the Rocky Mountain Boys. Their tales of adventure and prospective riches to be had in trapping the innumerable beaver that inhabited the rivers of the frontier stoked Rose's imagination. Both young men excitedly agreed that their next venture would be as fur trappers in the Great Rocky Mountains. Both Rose and Lewis had signed up for service as camp keepers with a fur company leaving for Independence, Missouri, and within a few weeks, both found themselves on another riverboat, this one heading up the Missouri River. Both young men delighted in the prospects of their new lot in life, and dreamed of the adventures to come in fighting grizzly bears and Blackfoot, in exploring lands few had ever seen before,
and in taking home a small fortune with which to finance the rest of their lives. However, the reality of the fur-trapping life was in fact far removed from the notions of adventure and exploration that abounded in the minds of both Rose and Lewis. Instead, as they had quickly learned, life as a member of a fur-trapping company was one rife with discomfort, privation, and long periods of drudgery, interspersed with moments of bone-rattling terror. And, as they had quickly surmised from their few experiences already, the greatest cause of that terror amongst any fur-trapping company in the Rocky Mountains was not the grizzly bear, the avalanche, nor the flash flood. It was, indisputably, the Blackfoot. Throughout the whole of what will eventually become the states of Montana, as well as parts of Idaho and southern Alberta, Canada, the Blackfoot are the unquestioned rulers of the land. They have ascended to this apex position via centuries of hard fighting against rival tribes like the Arikara and the Cree, taking every square mile by way of brute force and military superiority. Lewis and Clark had met the tribe on their expedition, remarking of their impressive warrior society and sheer ferocity. For decades now, they have ruthlessly defended their hard-won territories from incursions by any intruders, be they natives from other tribes or fur-trapping companies. Now, Rose, Lewis, and the rest of their companions are meeting the full weight of the Blackfoot's ire as the pine trees that surround them go up in flames, one by one, and with startling rapidity. Soon, the Blackfoot attack resumes. Several more of the horses are shot down, as the Blackfoot seek not only to trap the mountain men in flames, but to take away their means of escape as well. Several of the stricken animals make a final, primal attempt to flee from the projectiles and flames, only to fall dead in the open field that lies in front of the trappers' position. The trappers again fire a concentrated volley from their rifles into the charging warriors, again stalling their attack. But with every shot, the mountain men are further depleting their supplies of ammunition. Soon, several of the men have completely run out of bullets. Having no ability to fight any further, these men take charge of leading their increasingly panicked horses further down the hillside, away from the smoke and flames. This leaves even fewer trappers fighting back at the timberline, as the Blackfoot attacks continue to increase in both frequency and ferocity. Meanwhile, the intensity of the flames increased to such an extent that the trappers are forced to abandon their position and take to the open ground that lies directly between themselves and the Blackfoot. They are now taking cover behind the bodies of several dead horses. The ground around them is soaked in the animals' blood, making reloading and firing an even more cumbersome task. Still, amidst these gory circumstances, the fight carries on, as another attack from the Blackfoot bears down upon them. Several more warriors fall to the trappers' bullets, and the desperation of both sides becomes even more palpable as the sun reaches its noontime apex. Situated behind the stiffening carcasses of one of the unfortunate horses, with the hellscape of flames rising behind him, and the incessant attacks of the Blackfoot in front of him, Isaac Rose now finds himself out of ammunition. During a brief intermission in the fighting, he crawls from his position to the tree line and retreats down the hill in order to care for and contain the horses. He spends several minutes helping to contain the fire around the area where his comrades are holding the remaining horses, before finally deciding to scramble back up the hill and crawl back to another trapper's position, also situated behind another of the dead horses. This trapper's name is Christopher Hewson Carson, better known as Kit Carson. Roughly the same age as Rose, and himself a relative newcomer to the frontier, Carson has resolutely staked out his fighting position and, despite the chaos, appears seemingly unmoved. Rose now asks Carson if he has any ammunition that he can spare. Carson fortuitously answers that he indeed does, handing over 6 bullets along with an ample amount of gunpowder. As this transaction occurs, the two men survey the battlefield in front of them, rife with bodies of fallen warriors and horses alike. Suddenly, a patch of pine trees, untouched by the flames, catches Rose's eye. He suggests to Carson that if they can make their way to the trees undetected, they may be able to flank the Blackfoot position. Seeing no better options, Carson agrees, and the two begin a long, wary crawl to the untouched pines. On their crawl, they join forces with another trapper named Mark Head, himself hunkered down behind one of the bodies of the dead horses. The three men now move from position to position, inching their way ever closer to their destination, all the while waiting for the next Blackfoot attack. However, miraculously, the trio finally arrive at the lot of pine trees undetected. From here, they silently take stock of their situation. For several torturously prolonged minutes, they are unable to detect any sign of the Blackfoot. Then, suddenly, all three men hear two voices conversing in the Blackfoot language roughly 100 yards away. Peering around one of the pine trees, they see roughly a dozen Blackfoot warriors, themselves holding counsel on their next move. Sensing that now might be their only chance to avert the next attack, the three trappers check their weapons, and then aim and fire, one after the other, hoping to elicit the illusion of being a far larger force. Three Blackfoot warriors now tumble to the ground, thudding hard into the Montana dirt, as their comrades make a hasty retreat, riding back to the main contingent of Blackfoot who lie just over the hill. Though the trappers expect a retributive attack, one does not come. It seems that the Blackfoot, believing that perhaps reinforcements for the trappers have arrived, have chosen to vacate the battlefield, leaving the trappers to tend to their new predicament of wounded men and a gravely depleted herd of horses. The three trappers, Carson, Rose, and Head, make their way back to the tree line, and then down the hill, where they meet with the remainder of their comrades. They are all fatigued from the day's fighting and fearful of another surprise attack to come. Suddenly, just over the hill, they again hear the thunderous sound of approaching hoofbeats. Again, tensions rise, and the men, now nearly entirely depleted of bullets and gunpowder, again shoulder their weapons and await an oncoming attack. But, this time, they are greeted with a welcome sight. It is veteran mountain man Jim Bridger, himself already a legend on the frontier, accompanied by several fellow trappers from the American Fur Company. Hours earlier, two of the trappers who had been with Carson and Rose's party had escaped and alerted Bridger of their companions' plight. Though Bridger and his companions have missed the battle, they are indeed a welcome sight to all, as they bring with them much-needed ammunition, food, and water. Now, a merry scene unfolds as the trappers celebrate their surviving the day. The wounded men are attended to, with several of the mountain men, though not formally being trained, being thoroughly adept in the ways of frontier and battlefield medicine. Bridger himself, master of seemingly every facet of frontier life, tends to one of the trappers who has been hit in the shoulder by a Blackfoot bullet. Acting as battlefield surgeon, he carefully trims a pine tree branch and uses it to probe the man's wound and locate the bullet within. Finding the projectile to be lodged near the man's back, Bridger uses his large hunting knife to make an incision near the shoulder blade and extract the lead ball. He then cleans and bandages the wound before constructing a makeshift sling for the wounded man. A testament to Bridger's skill in medicine, the man will recover from his wound in mere weeks. Though the care they receive may indeed be close to premier, considering the circumstances, there is little to be offered by the mountain men in the way of empathy. The frontier is, indeed, an unforgiving place, and the mountain men have adapted, as an integral part of their culture, a dark humor, as a sort of communal therapy by way of ribbing and ridicule. As would later be described in Rose's autobiography entitled 4 Years in the Rockies, quote, "In some respects, the Rocky Mountain trapper is very peculiar. He has an eye only toward the reckless, the daring, the absurd, the humorous, and, if any one of them is green enough to tell a tale of sorrow or misfortune, Instead of meeting with sympathy and condolence, he is chaffed and joked by all of them, and this eventually proves to be the best tonic, as he soon begins to think of his misfortunes as not so bad as he first thought, and in a short time will even laugh at them himself. Even in the midst of deadly conflict, when the fire was roaring and crackling in every direction, and the bullets and arrows of their enemies flying among them, the yells of 150 bloodthirsty warriors flying around them, even at such a time as this, loud bursts of laughter could be heard amongst the trappers as some witty sally met their ear. As the trappers take stock of the damages to their supplies and horses, Markhead is distraught to see that among the dead animals is his prized steed, a horse named Plute. In keeping with the mountain man's tradition of meeting sorrow with humor, in the coming months, any engagement with the Blackfoot will include his fellow trappers claiming that any warrior they brought down was, quote, the fellow that killed old Plute. For the moment, however, it is decided that the two trappers' parties should unite and make their way over the mountains and to their winter quarters. With the winter coming on quickly, the trappers can waste no time in gathering their remaining mounts and supplies, and leaving this site at once, heading back over the looming Rockies. But they decide to spend one night at their current location before beginning their arduous trip. The next morning, just before the party departs, a few of the trappers decide to survey the lot of pine trees where Rose, Carson, and Head had hidden and made their attack. Initially, the men find nothing, but just before they make their return to their comrades, they hear a faint whimpering coming from the tall grass just beyond the pine trees. Investigating the source of the noise, they find a young Blackfoot woman. Her leg has been broken by a bullet, and she is unable to walk. Her companions, likely not seeing her because of where she fell, have left without her. The trappers, after doing all they can to assure the woman that they mean her no further harm, bring the Blackfoot woman back to their camp. Here, her wounds are dressed with the same care as the trappers had received. Each man among them, despite any lingering resentment for her fellow tribesmen, is moved not only by the severity of her injuries, but the stoicism with which she bears them. With her people now gone, and her wounds rendering her helpless, the trappers contrive to bring the woman along with them. A litter is constructed, and the woman, who informs the men that her name is Chilsippi, or Antelope, is gingerly laid onto a makeshift bed of buffalo hides strewn across the litter. Then, finally, the trappers begin their journey to Fort Hall. In the coming weeks, Chilsippi will become a treasured companion and an indispensable helper. For their part, the trappers will afford her the warmest lodge in the camp and the choicest cuts of meat. In return, Chilsippi, after roughly 2 weeks of convalescence, mends their garments and moccasins, a skill at which she shows a remarkable level of mastery and dexterity. This relationship, one forged between former combatants turned into inseparable friends, is not uncommon on the frontier. While the fight over resources and territory could, and often did, result in ruthless, bloodthirsty combat, the brutal nature of survival itself did, at times, result in brief flashes of humanity between warring parties. For their parts, Isaac Rose, Joe Lewis, Mark Head, Kit Carson, and Jim Bridger will all continue their careers in the fur trade for years to come. This period in the mid-1830s will ultimately be seen by many as the peak of the mountain man trade, and, though the danger of life on the frontier would continue to be a very real threat, it is not enough to deter the countless young men who seek the prospective fame, adventure, and adulation that potentially accompany life as a trapper. Life for the Blackfoot, as well, will continue on in the ways that they have known for generations. Their lives will continue to be dictated by the same seasons of hunting, travel, and intertribal warfare that had shaped the lives of their forefathers. However, this time period will ultimately prove to be the twilight of the Blackfoot's long and storied tenure as rulers of the northern plains. In 1855, in an effort to squash intertribal warfare in the region, a treaty was signed which granted the Blackfoot and their allies the Gros Ventres rights to what is today the eastern half of Montana. but in the coming decades, this agreement would be broken time and again by the United States government. With their once expansive territory now dwindling, the Blackfoot were eventually forced to sign the Sweetgrass Hills Treaty, which essentially relegated them to reservation life from then on. But the conflict, controversy, and tragedy of the Blackfoot's plight under the U.S. government, as well as the countless tales of bravery, industry, and terror from the annals of the history of the mountain men, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. South Dakota, June 1823. On the vast expanse of the undulating prairie that extends to the horizon in every direction, a contingent of mules, horses, and men moves warily alongside a river, with pensive eyes switching from the water to the surrounding landscape, searching for signs of danger. They are hundreds of miles from anything resembling a city, in territory that does not belong to them. They are a mix of men from a plethora of backgrounds and ethnicities, dressed in a menagerie of wool shirts, buckskin leggings, boots, moccasins, serapes, raccoon skin caps, and belts. Their common goal, put simply, is money, made by way of accumulating and selling beaver pelts, the coveted material that makes the popular top hats of the day worn throughout New York, Paris, and London. Their methods are simple. Set traps for the beavers, after which the animals will become ensnared in the traps and drown. Then, the trappers will return to collect the beaver pelts and repeat this process until the beaver population has been exhausted, before finally moving on. But, in this case, simple does not equal easy. Opposing them are the elements, from blazing heat to icy cold, from snow to dust storms, from droughts to flash flooding. Animal attacks, from the numerous grizzly bears which prowl the continent, to rattlesnakes, to buffalo stampedes, pose an ever-present threat. Hostile native tribes like the Blackfoot, Arikara, and Comanche have, already, in these early years of the fur trade, killed many trappers in gruesome ways for violating their tribal territorial bounds. Among this party of men are some who will go on to become legends in the annals of mountain man history. They are commanded by William H. Ashley and Major Andrew Henry, and among their ranks are Hugh Glass and Jedediah Smith, all men whose future exploits will become the stuff of mountain man legend. Smith is an anomaly amongst this already anomalous lot, as he is a devout Methodist, reads the Bible daily, and refrains from coarse language, as well as dalliances with unknown women and strong drink. On this day, he is approached by Major Henry and directed to ride south to Ashley's fort, aptly known as Fort Ashley. He is to inform Ashley that the company is in need of more horses, and that the Arikara tribe will likely be the closest people with which to trade in horseflesh. Jedediah Smith is still a relative neophyte to the world of trapping, but he is a man on the rise within the ranks of his company, as his reputation as a stalwart and trustworthy companion grows by the day. And so, Smith sets out to the south, and is fortuitously met by Ashley on the trail. The pair then proceed to the Arikara village, where they seek to buy more horses. The Arikara, a northern plains semi-agricultural tribe known both for their prowess in trade and warfare, whose ire had been stirred by some recent bad dealings with other white traders, are in a less than cordial mood. However, Ashley and his men have guns and ammunition that the Arikara know they can acquire through few, if any, other sources. Thus, there is a terse and tense peace, as often happens in these instances on the frontier. In the wilds of North America, native tribes and fur trappers are not necessarily antagonistic. In fact, sometimes the case can be quite the opposite. For centuries in colonial America and Canada, native tribes had been employed by large fur company magnates to supply them with the highly profitable furs of the deer, mink, otter, and beaver that had profligated their homeland. However, as game populations began to dwindle, the fur companies eventually brought their search for pelts to the expanses of the North American prairies, and Rocky Mountains. The tribes who inhabited these lands oftentimes expressed little to no interest in working for fiat currency or goods when their lifestyles and economies were focused on hunting the immense herds of American bison that populated the plains. Thus, in the spirit of their predecessors in men like Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton, who were known as long hunters, the fur companies have scoured the outlying cities of the frontier, offering gainful employment to any man with the gumption and skills to venture onto the inhospitable frontier to procure the valuable fur of the innumerable beaver that inhabited the rivers and streams that crisscrossed the continent. Still, fur companies routinely employ native persons as translators, trackers, and trappers. Many of the early mountain men owe their skills to lessons learned from their native guides. Even in the 19th century, in the middle of the plains, no culture existed entirely in a vacuum. This could be seen not only in the dress of both native trappers and tribes, who often traded in various garbs such as jewelry made from beads from China, hats made in factories on the eastern seaboard, and buffalo robes harvested and carefully prepared in centuries-old fashion by native tribeswomen. While tools such as firearms indeed proved invaluable to the native tribes, so too did steel tools and implements such as axes, knives, and cooking utensils. Thus, a robust trade between the fur-trapping companies and the inhabiting tribes of the northern plains has been a mainstay for years, even in the 1820s. At the Arikara village, initial dealings are made between Smith, Ashley, and the Arikara. As the sun begins to set, it is mutually agreed that trading will continue the following day. Ashley splits his forces into two, leaving one on land to guard the supplies they had brought out from the boats, and the other to man the two boats which were anchored about 30 yards from the banks of the river. It is decided that Ashley will be in direct command of the boats, and Smith will be in charge of the force guarding the supplies. Now, nearly all of the mountain men present go about their nightly duty of making dinner, cleaning their weapons, checking their supplies, and preparing for the next day's travel and trading. But when all have finally bedded down for the night, two men from the mountain man's party sneak into the Arikara camp with whiskey and trinkets that they hope to trade for illicit relations with the Arikara women. This proves to be a fatal mistake. Just after midnight, Colonel Ashley is awakened by 3 Arikara warriors who have snuck onto the boat and are attempting to loot its cargo. He brandishes his pistol and chases them off the boat. But just as the Arikara make it to the shore, and the sound of sloshing water from their swim strokes goes quiet, it is suddenly replaced by the frantic screams of one of the 2 mountain men who have snuck into the Arikara camp. He and his companion had indeed found the Arikara women they were hoping to, but they had also found the Arikara men, who were not happy with the presence of intruders attempting to defile their wives, daughters, and sisters. His companion has been cut down where he was found. The surviving trapper, a man named Edward Rose, has escaped and now appears on the banks of the river, making his way, as fast as he can, for the trapper's camp on shore. As he runs, he screams that his partner in mischief, a man named Aaron Stevens, is dead, and the Arikara are now in a collectively angry mood. Still cloaked in pre-dawn darkness and alerted to both the attempted robbery of Ashley's boat and the killing of their comrade in the camp by the now enraged Arikara, the mountain men begin to hurriedly and vociferously debate their options. Some argue for immediately moving the horses they have, a sizable herd by this point, to the opposite shore before daybreak, so that they might be in a better position to flee when the sun does come up, with at least the river between them and the expected Arikara attack. Others argue for the retrieval of Stephen's body. As these debates carry on, a lone Arikara suddenly appears on the horizon above the riverbanks. Still in the dark, he calls out that he will try to broker a deal for the return of their comrade's body, for the price of one of their best horses. The mountain men agree to this, but a short time later, the enterprising Arikara returns to inform them that unfortunately he will not be able to uphold his end of the deal. Stevens's body has in fact been so badly mutilated that there is nothing left to return to them. This, understandably sends a cold chill through the ranks of the shore party. It is decided that they will now have to move the horses as quickly as possible as the sunrise nears with every passing minute. Remaining calm and cool by all accounts, Jed Smith embraces his first real opportunity at leadership and calmly directs the movement of the horses across the river. However, as the sun begins to rise and a large number of horses and men are still mid-river or on the near bank waiting their turn, the mountain men are greeted with a horrifying sight. Silhouetted in the new morning sunlight are hundreds of Arikara warriors, tamping shot down into their muskets, nocking their arrows, and taking up offensive positions. The full gravity of the situation is now painfully apparent to everyone present. They are stuck, with the enemy having the high ground and no cover to be found. Within moments, musket balls, spears, and arrows begin to rain down on them from above. Dozens of horses and a number of trappers fall dead in the initial volley, with many others bravely wounded. The screams of the injured and dying men and horses fills the air, as Ashley and the men on the boats attempt to meet them on the other shore and make their getaway. The men on the boats provide what covering fire they can, and the men on shore take cover behind the bodies of the dead horses. From here, as chaos reigns all around, Jed Smith coolly and calmly doles out directions to those in his charge. As he and his men fire and reload, they simultaneously make strategic retreats, moving by leapfrogging from one defensive position to the next until reaching the comparative safety of the boats. Amidst all of this, Ashley's boat has run aground momentarily on a sandbar. The other boat, at around this same time, cuts ties to their anchor and begins moving downstream in an attempt to at least save themselves from this seemingly hopeless situation. Ashley's boat is quickly freed and makes its way as close to the shore as possible. Smith and his men finally reach the banks of the river, dive in, and begin to frantically swim. Some are hit by arrows and musket balls and sink under the surface, never to be seen again. Some are swept downriver beyond the extended oars and hands of their comrades, also never to be seen again. The lucky few who managed to make it onto the boats, including Jed Smith and Hugh Glass, now hunker down and return fire as the boats make their way as quickly as possible down the Missouri River and out of range of Arikara musket and arrow fire. For some of these men, this will be the end of their mountain man adventures. Those who decide they have had enough of this wild and dangerous life are put on boats back to St. Louis, along with their injured and recovering comrades. No one blames them for preferring the comforts of home to this lonely land where life is all too often short and seemingly cheap. But the careers of William Ashley, Hugh Glass, and Jedediah Smith are far from over. One incident immediately following the battle speaks to the human cost of this attack that will be felt by families scattered all over the American states back east. Hugh Glass himself will go on to pen a heart-wrenching letter to the family of John Gardner, a mountain man who had been killed in the Arikara fight. The letter reads, "Dear Sir, my painful duty is to tell you of the death of your son, who befell at the hands of the Indians 2nd June in the early morning. He lived little while after he was shot and asked me to inform you of his sad fate. We brought him to the ship, where he soon died. Mr. Jedediah Smith, young man of our company, made a powerful prayer which moved all of us greatly, and I am persuaded that John died in peace. His body we buried with others near this camp and marked the graves with a log. His things we send to you. The savages are greatly treacherous. We traded with them as friends, but after great storm of rain and thunder, they came at us before light, and many were hurt. I myself was shot in the leg. Master Ashley is bound to stay in these parts till the traitors are rightly punished. Your obedient servant, Hugh Glass." This letter denotes not only Glass's deep sense of humanity, as well as his anger towards the Arikara, but it is the first mention of the piety and character of Jedediah Smith. Smith would mount an expedition along with an unnamed French-Canadian trader to a nearby fort in the hopes of mounting an even larger retributive force to supplement those that Ashley had already mustered. After this, he would carry on to travel perhaps more country than any other mountain man in history. But the many stories of the legendary exploits of Hugh Glass, William Ashley, and Jedediah Smith are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us. If you liked this story, click on one of the videos on your screen now to hear more. Also, if you'd like to learn more about Old West history, be sure to sign up for the HOKC newsletter. Link in the description. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button below. And we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.